In the midst of a brutal snowstorm on Highway 70, a black diner owner quietly counted her last $47 with only 7 days left before losing everything. At her lowest moment, 15 weary Hell's Angels knocked, seeking shelter. Without hesitation, she opened the door and shared her final meal. By morning, the roar of hundreds of motorcycles filled the air outside her diner. Before we dive in, what time are you listening? Where are you from? Drop a comment below and tell me. Sarah Williams stood behind the counter of Midnight Haven Diner, staring at the stack of crumpled bills in her weathered hands. $47. That was it. That was all that stood between her and the final notice tucked beneath the cash register, the one that gave her exactly 7 days before the bank took everything. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the small diner perched on Highway 70 in the Colorado mountains. Snow fell in thick, angry sheets, turning the world beyond the glass into a white void. At 50 years old, Sarah had seen plenty of storms, but this one felt different. This one felt like an ending. She moved slowly around the empty diner, her footsteps echoing off the worn linoleum floor. The red vinyl booths sat empty, their surfaces cracked from years of use. The coffee pot gurgled weakly, half full of the bitter brew that had been sitting there since noon. It was nearly 8 o'clock now, and she hadn't seen a customer in over 3 hours. Sarah paused at booth number 4, Robert's favorite spot. Even 2 years after the cancer took him, she could still see him sitting there, his gentle smile warming the room more than any heater ever could. They'd bought this place together 15 years ago with nothing but dreams and a small inheritance from her grandmother. "We'll make it work, baby," Robert used to say, his dark eyes twinkling with optimism. "This place will be a light for travelers, a home away from home." Now the lights flickered overhead, threatening to go out just like everything else. The heating system groaned and wheezed, fighting a losing battle against the mountain cold. Sarah pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and walked back to the counter, where the foreclosure notice seemed to mock her with its official letterhead and cold, bureaucratic language. The diner's CB radio crackled weakly in the corner, its antenna bent from years of neglect. Once that radio had been their lifeline to the trucking community, a constant stream of voices sharing road conditions, warnings, and the occasional joke. Now it mostly sat silent, just another relic of better times. Sarah opened the register again, counting the money one more time as if the numbers might magically change. They didn't. $47 wouldn't even cover the electric bill, let alone the 3 months of back payments the bank demanded. She'd already sold her wedding ring, Robert's tools, everything of value they'd accumulated over their 23 years of marriage. This diner was all she had left. The wind picked up outside, shaking the building so hard that the old neon sign buzzed and flickered. Through the window she could see the snow piling up against the gas pumps, burying them under white drifts that looked like gravestones in a cemetery. Highway 70 was completely invisible now, lost beneath the storm. Sarah glanced at the clock above the coffee machine. 8:15. Time to close up, flip the sign and admit defeat. Tomorrow she'd call the lawyer, maybe see if she could work out some kind of payment plan, though she knew it was hopeless. The bank had been patient enough. She was reaching for the light switch when she heard it. A low rumble that cut through the howling wind like thunder. At first she thought it might be a snowplow, but the sound was different. Deeper. More rhythmic. Like a heartbeat made of steel and chrome. Sarah pressed her face to the window, squinting through the snow. At first she saw nothing but white. Then slowly shapes began to emerge from the storm. Headlights. Lots of them. And beneath the lights the distinctive silhouettes of motorcycles, big ones, Harley-Davidsons by the look of them. The rumble grew louder as the bikes approached, their engines revving against the wind. Sarah counted 15 machines in total, all riding in tight formation despite the treacherous conditions. As they pulled into the diner's parking lot, their headlights swept across the windows like searchlights, filling the empty dining room with harsh white light. Sarah stepped back from the window, her heart pounding. She'd heard stories about motorcycle clubs, seen them in movies, but she'd never actually encountered one. These men, and they were all men, she could tell even through their heavy winter gear, looked like something out of a nightmare. Leather jackets, boots, helmets that hid their faces. They moved with the confidence of people who weren't used to being told no. The lead rider dismounted first, a tall man with broad shoulders who seemed to command the others without saying a word. He looked toward the diner and Sarah could feel his gaze even through the window. Slowly, deliberately, he began walking toward the front door. Sarah's hand hovered over the light switch. She could turn off the lights, lock the door, pretend the diner was closed. These men wouldn't know the difference. They'd probably just move on, find somewhere else to wait out the storm. Somewhere that wasn't her problem. But as the man approached the door, she saw something that stopped her cold. He was limping. Not badly, but enough to notice. Behind him the other riders were dismounting, and she could see that several of them were struggling. They'd been riding in this storm for hours, maybe longer. They were cold, exhausted, and probably desperate for shelter. The man reached the door and paused, his gloved hand hovering over the handle. Through the glass Sarah could see his face clearly now. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 45, with gray streaking his dark beard. His eyes were tired, weathered by years on the road. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. He knocked 3 gentle raps that somehow managed to be both respectful and urgent. Sarah looked back at the $47 on the counter, then at the foreclosure notice, then at the man waiting in the storm. Robert's voice echoed in her memory, a light for travelers, baby. A home away from home. She walked to the door and turned the lock. The moment Sarah opened the door, the full force of the storm hit her like a physical blow. Snow swirled into the diner and the temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The man standing on her threshold was covered head to toe in ice and snow, his leather jacket frozen stiff, his beard white with frost. But it wasn't just one man. Behind him Sarah could see the others dismounting from their motorcycles, and her breath caught in her throat. These weren't ordinary bikers. The leather jackets bore the unmistakable patches she'd seen in news reports, the Death's Head logo, the winged skull, the words Hell's Angels emblazoned across broad shoulders and backs. 15 of them, all massive men with arms thick as tree trunks, faces weathered by years of hard living, and the kind of presence that made smart people cross to the other side of the street. The leader was easily 6'4", with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a ponytail and a gray beard that reached his chest. Tattoos covered every visible inch of his arms, intricate designs that told stories Sarah didn't want to know. A jagged scar ran from his left temple to his jawline, and his eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice, held the weight of someone who'd seen too much and done things he couldn't take back. Behind him the others looked like they'd stepped out of a movie about motorcycle gangs. One had a shaved head covered in tattoos, including a spider web on his neck. Another sported a mohawk despite being well into his 50s, with arms so heavily muscled they strained the seams of his leather jacket. The youngest couldn't have been more than 25, but he carried himself with the swagger of someone trying to prove he belonged with these dangerous men. "Ma'am," the leader said, his voice rough from the cold and probably decades of cigarettes, "I know this is an imposition, but we've been riding for 12 hours straight. The highway's completely shut down about 10 miles back, and we're not going to make it much further in this weather." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to close the door, to lock it, to call the police. These men looked like they could tear her diner apart with their bare hands, and probably had done worse to people who'd crossed them. The patches on their jackets weren't decorations. They were warnings. But then she saw something that gave her pause. Despite their intimidating appearance, they stood respectfully in the snow, waiting for her answer. None of them pushed forward or tried to force their way in. The leader kept his hands visible, his posture non-threatening despite his size. And there was something in his eyes, exhaustion, yes, but also a kind of desperate hope that she recognized all too well. "How many of you are there?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it. 15, the man replied. "I'm Jake Morrison. We're part of the Thunder Ridge chapter, heading back from a memorial service down in Denver. We've got cash for food and coffee, and we won't cause any trouble. We just need somewhere warm to wait out the storm." Sarah looked past Jake at the group of men removing their helmets. They were a terrifying sight. Beards, tattoos, scars that told stories of violence and hard living. Hands that looked like they could crush bone, faces that had seen the wrong side of too many fights. But she also saw something else, exhaustion that went bone deep, the kind that came from fighting the elements for hours on end. These men, dangerous as they might be, were at the end of their rope. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "All of you." The relief on Jake's face was immediate and profound. "Thank you," he said simply. "You have no idea what this means." The Hells Angels filed in one by one, stomping snow off their boots and shaking ice from their jackets. They were massive men, most of them the kind who'd learned to take up space in the world through necessity and reputation. Their leather jackets creaked as they moved, the patches and pins catching the diner's fluorescent light, chapter names, ranks, badges that marked territory and allegiances in a world Sarah had never been part of. But despite their fearsome appearance, they moved carefully in the small diner, conscious of their size, respectful of the space they'd been given. The one with the mohawk actually held the door for the youngest member, and Sarah caught several of them wiping their boots extra clean before stepping onto her floor. Sarah counted them as they entered. 15, just as Jake had said. The oldest looked to be in his 60s, gray-haired and dignified despite the death's head on his jacket. The youngest, the one she'd noticed earlier, had nervous eyes and hands that shook slightly as he pulled off his gloves, looking more like a scared college kid than a member of America's most notorious motorcycle club. "Find seats wherever you can," Sarah told them, moving behind the counter. "I'll get some coffee going." The men settled into the booths and counter stools with obvious gratitude, their frozen leather creaking as they moved. Up close, Sarah could see the details that the storm had hidden, the intricate artwork of their tattoos, the careful maintenance of their patches, the way they instinctively arranged themselves so that the older, more senior members took the best spots while the younger ones deferred without being asked. The young one, Sarah heard someone call him Danny, sat near the window, still shivering despite the warmth of the diner. An older man with intricate tattoos covering both arms and sergeant at arms embroidered beneath his chapter patch took the stool closest to the counter, nodding respectfully when Sarah made eye contact. "Haven't seen weather like this in years," Jake said, settling onto a stool near the register. His jacket hung open now, revealing more patches, President in bold letters, service ribbons that suggested military background, and a small American flag pin that seemed oddly patriotic for someone society labeled an outlaw. Sarah poured coffee into thick white mugs, the familiar ritual calming her nerves. "Sugar and cream are on the counter," she said. "Help yourselves." As the men warmed their hands on the hot mugs, Sarah took stock of her situation. 15, Hells Angels, a nearly empty freezer, and $47 to her name. These weren't the kind of men you wanted to disappoint or turn away hungry. But looking at their faces, weathered, tired, grateful for simple warmth, she realized that beneath the leather and patches and fearsome reputation they were just human beings caught in a storm. By 10 o'clock the storm had only gotten worse. The wind howled like a living thing, and the snow was falling so hard that the windows looked like they'd been painted white. Jake's prediction about the highway being closed proved optimistic. According to the radio, Interstate 70 was shut down in both directions, with no estimate for when it might reopen. "Could be tomorrow morning, could be 2 days, Jake told Sarah as she refilled his coffee for the third time. "State Patrol's not even trying to clear it until the wind dies down." Sarah nodded, doing mental calculations that didn't add up no matter how she worked them. 15 men, 2 days, virtually no food left in the kitchen. The eggs and bacon were long gone, the hash browns a memory. She'd managed to find a few cans of soup in the back storage room, but that wouldn't stretch far. Her $47 might buy enough groceries for one day if the roads were clear and the stores were open, which they weren't. The bikers had settled in for the night, some dozing in the booths, others playing cards with a worn deck that Pete had produced from his jacket pocket. They'd offered to pay for their meal, but Sarah had waved them off. How could she charge them for the scraps she'd managed to cobble together? Danny had fallen asleep with his head on the table, exhaustion finally overtaking him. He looked even younger in sleep, maybe 22 or 23, with the kind of face that belonged in a college classroom rather than on the back of a Harley. Marcus had draped his leather jacket over the kid's shoulders, a gesture so gentle it made Sarah's throat tight. "He reminds me of my son," Marcus explained quietly when he caught Sarah watching. "Same age, same stubborn streak, always trying to prove he's tougher than he really is." "Where's your son now?" Sarah asked. "Afghanistan," Marcus replied. "Third tour. Comes home next month if all goes well." His voice carried the weight of a father's worry, the kind that never really went away no matter how old your children got. Sarah poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, surveying her unexpected guests. In the harsh fluorescent light, they looked less intimidating than they had when they'd first arrived. Their leather jackets hung over chair backs, revealing ordinary clothes underneath: flannel shirts, worn jeans, work boots that had seen better days. These were working men, blue-collar guys who probably had more in common with her late husband than with the movie stereotypes she'd expected. Jake approached the counter, his expression serious. "Sarah, we need to talk about payment. You've been more than generous, but we can't just..." "Don't worry about it," Sarah interrupted. "It's just food." "No, it's not," Jake said firmly. "It's hospitality, it's kindness. And it's costing you money you probably don't have." Sarah felt her cheeks flush. Was her financial situation that obvious? She tried to keep her voice steady. "I manage just fine." Jake's eyes moved to the foreclosure notice sticking out from under the register, and Sarah realized her attempt at discretion had failed. His expression softened with understanding. "How long do you have?" he asked quietly. 7 days, Sarah admitted, the words falling out of her mouth before she could stop them. "But that's my problem, not yours." "The hell it is," Jake said. "You opened your door to us when you didn't have to, you fed us when you couldn't afford to. That makes it our problem too." Sarah shook her head. "I appreciate the sentiment, but there's nothing you can do. I'm behind on 3 months of payments, and the bank's not interested in sob stories." Jake was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug. Then he looked up at her with eyes that seemed to see straight through her defenses. "Tell me about this place," he said. "How long have you owned it?" 15 years, Sarah replied. "My husband Robert and I bought it with my grandmother's inheritance. It was his dream, a place where travelers could find a hot meal and a friendly face, no matter what time of night they rolled in." "Sounds like he was a good man." "The best," Sarah said, her voice catching slightly. "Cancer took him 2 years ago. I've been trying to keep the place running, but..." She gestured helplessly at the empty diner, the flickering lights, the general air of barely controlled decay. "But it's hard to run a business on memories and good intentions," Jake finished. "Something like that." Jake was quiet again, and Sarah could see him thinking, weighing options she couldn't guess at. Finally he spoke. "What if I told you that you've helped more people than you know? What if I told you that this place, your kindness has probably saved lives?" Sarah frowned. "I'm not sure what you mean." 15 years is a long time, Jake said. "A lot of travelers pass through this stretch of highway. A lot of people in trouble, looking for help. You remember all of them?" Sarah shook her head. "There've been thousands, but you helped them all, didn't you? Hot coffee, a warm meal, maybe a kind word when they needed it most." "I tried to," Sarah said. "Robert always said we were supposed to be a light for people, a beacon, you know. Someone who'd leave the porch light on for travelers." Jake smiled, and there was something almost secretive about it. "A beacon," he repeated. "Yeah, that's exactly what you are." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, a commotion arose from one of the booths. Pete was shaking Danny awake, his voice urgent but gentle. "Kid, wake up. You're having a nightmare." Danny jerked upright, his eyes wild and unfocused. For a moment he looked around the diner like he couldn't remember where he was. Then recognition dawned, and his shoulders sagged with relief. "Sorry," he mumbled. "Bad dreams. They come and go. Want to talk about it?" Pete asked, settling back into his seat across from the younger man. Danny shook his head, but after a moment he spoke anyway. "It's always the same dream. I'm lost on some dark highway, my bike's broken down, and there's nowhere to go. No lights, no help, just endless darkness." He looked around the warm diner, at the faces of his fellow riders, at Sarah behind the counter. "But then I wake up, and I'm here, and it's okay." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite name. How many people had sat in these same booths, found comfort in this same warm light? How many travelers had been lost and cold and desperate, only to find refuge in the unlikely beacon she and Robert had built on this forgotten stretch of mountain highway? She looked at Jake, who was watching her with that same knowing smile. "What aren't you telling me?" she asked. "Nothing you won't figure out soon enough," he replied. But right now we need to focus on practical matters. You said the bank wants 3 months of back payments. Sarah nodded reluctantly. How much? $12,000, she admitted. Plus late fees and legal costs, it's probably closer to 15. Jake whistled low. That's serious money. More than I'll ever have, Sarah said. Look, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but $15,000 isn't the kind of thing you find in couch cushions. This place is finished, and maybe that's okay. Maybe it's time. No, Jake said, his voice sharp enough to cut through her resignation. It's not time. Not for a place like this. Not for a woman like you. He stood up, fishing his cell phone out of his pocket. I'm going to make some calls, and Sarah. She looked up at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice. Don't you dare give up yet. This story isn't over. As Jake walked toward the front door, presumably to get better cell reception, Sarah found herself staring after him. She didn't understand what was happening, didn't know what kind of calls he intended to make, or what difference they could possibly make. But for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something she'd almost forgotten how to recognize. Hope. Jake returned from making his phone calls with snow in his hair and an expression Sarah couldn't read. He'd been outside for nearly an hour, pacing back and forth in the storm, his voice occasionally rising above the wind as he spoke to whoever was on the other end of the line. The other bikers had watched him through the windows, exchanging glances that suggested they knew something Sarah didn't. Well? Pete asked when Jake finally came back inside, stamping snow off his boots. Tomorrow morning, Jake said simply. Maybe sooner if the road's clear. What's tomorrow morning? Sarah asked. But Jake just smiled and poured himself another cup of coffee. It was Marcus who broke the tension. The older biker had been quiet most of the evening, content to play cards and nurse his coffee, but now he was studying Sarah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. You know, he said slowly, you look familiar. Sarah raised an eyebrow. I doubt that. I don't get out much these days. No. I'm serious. Marcus set down his cards and really looked at her, his head tilted slightly as if trying to remember something important. How long did you say you've been running this place? 15 years. And before that, Robert and I lived in Denver. He was a truck driver, did long hauls all over the western states. I worked as a dispatcher for his company. Marcus snapped his fingers suddenly, so loudly that several of the other bikers looked up. That's it, Tommy Patterson. You saved Tommy Patterson's life. Sarah frowned. I'm sorry, I don't. Big guy, Redbeard, drove for Western Mountain Transport. Marcus was getting excited now, his voice rising. This would have been maybe 12, 13 years ago. He was having chest pains pulled off right here at your diner. The memory hit Sarah like a physical blow. She hadn't thought about that night in years, but suddenly it was vivid as yesterday. A trucker, alone and scared, clutching his chest in the parking lot. She'd found him there when she'd gone out to check the dumpster, called 911, then driven him to the hospital herself when the ambulance couldn't make it through a rockslide on the highway. Tommy, she said quietly. I remember Tommy, he's my brother-in-law, Marcus said, grinning now. Married my sister 5 years ago. He tells that story at every family gathering, how the angel in the mountains saved his life. How you stayed with him at the hospital all night. Called his wife, even paid for his parking when he couldn't find his wallet. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. It wasn't anything special. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, Marcus said firmly. Anyone wouldn't have. That's the point. He looked around the diner at his fellow bikers. Guys, I think we're sitting in a legend. The word legend seemed to electrify the group. Suddenly everyone was talking at once, comparing notes, sharing stories. It turned out that several of them had their own memories of Midnight Haven Diner, their own reasons to be grateful to the woman who ran it. Carlos remembered stopping here 5 years ago when his daughter had been in a car accident in Denver. Sarah had let him use the phone to call the hospital, given him directions to the fastest route, even packed him a sandwich for the road when he'd been too upset to think about eating. Pete recalled a night when his bike had broken down in a snowstorm much like this one. Sarah and Robert had not only fed him and let him stay warm, but Robert had helped him fix his bike, refusing payment for either the parts or the labor. And Danny, quiet, nervous Danny, suddenly spoke up with a story that made everyone go silent. You might not remember me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I was here 3 years ago. I was having a really bad time. My parents had kicked me out, I'd dropped out of college, lost my job. I was riding my bike west with no plan, no money, no hope. I was actually thinking about. He paused, swallowed hard. Well, about ending it all. Sarah felt her breath catch. I stopped here because my bike was almost out of gas and I was almost out of everything else. I had maybe $5 in my pocket, but you served me anyway. A full meal, coffee, pie. When I tried to pay, you said I looked like I was having a rough day and the meal was on the house. Danny's eyes were bright with unshed tears. You asked me where I was headed, and when I said I didn't know, you told me that was okay. Sometimes not knowing where you're going is the first step to finding where you belong. Then you gave me a business card for a friend of yours in Salt Lake City, said he might have work for someone willing to learn. Sarah remembered now, a skinny kid with hollow eyes and a motorcycle that sounded like it was held together with prayer and duct tape. She'd seen that look before, the look of someone who'd given up on tomorrow. That job changed my life, Danny continued. And the man who hired me, he became like a father to me. Helped me get back in school, introduced me to these guys. He gestured around the table at his fellow bikers. You saved my life that day, Sarah. Not just by feeding me but by reminding me that there were still good people in the world. People who cared about strangers. The diner fell silent except for the wind outside and the soft hum of the coffee machine. Sarah stood frozen behind the counter, overwhelmed by the weight of these revelations. She'd helped people over the years, sure, but she'd never thought of it as anything extraordinary. She'd just done what felt right, what Robert would have wanted her to do. There are more stories, Jake said quietly. A lot more. You've been a beacon on this highway for 15 years, Sarah. You've touched more lives than you know. I just served food, Sarah protested weakly. I just tried to be decent to people. Exactly, Marcus said. In a world that's gotten pretty indecent, that makes you special. Sarah sank onto a stool behind the counter, her legs suddenly unsteady. She thought about all the faces that had passed through this diner over the years, truckers, travelers, families on vacation, people running from something or towards something else. She'd fed them all, listened to their stories, offered what comfort she could. It had never occurred to her that she was doing anything remarkable. The calls I made tonight, Jake said, they were to people like Tommy Patterson, people who remember this place, who remember you, people who owe you a debt they've never been able to repay. You don't owe me anything, Sarah said. That's where you're wrong, Jake replied. And tomorrow morning, you're going to understand just how wrong. As if summoned by his words, new lights appeared outside the windows, not the single headlight of motorcycles this time, but the dual beams of cars and trucks, cutting through the storm like stars breaking through clouds. Jake looked out the window and smiled. Or maybe tonight. The first vehicle to pull into the parking lot was a pickup truck with Wyoming plates. Then came a sedan from Utah, followed by a semi-truck with Colorado markings. Within minutes the small parking lot was filling up with vehicles, their occupants climbing out into the storm and hurrying toward the diner's front door. Sarah watched in amazement as the door opened and people began filing in, men and women of all ages, all looking around the diner with expressions of recognition and gratitude. Some she remembered, others were strangers, but they all wore the same look of people coming home. The first person through the door was a big man with a red beard, his arms spread wide. Sarah Williams, he boomed. You beautiful angel, Tommy Patterson, in case you don't remember. You saved my worthless hide 13 years ago, and I've been looking for a chance to return the favor ever since. As Tommy enveloped her in a bear hug that lifted her off her feet, Sarah realized that Jake had been right. This story wasn't over, it was just beginning. By dawn, Midnight Haven Diner looked like the epicenter of the biggest Hells Angels gathering in Colorado history. What had started with 15 stranded bikers had grown into something Sarah couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. The parking lot was packed with motorcycles, dozens and dozens of them, their chrome gleaming in the morning sun, arranged in neat rows that stretched beyond the diner's property line. Sarah moved through the crowded diner in a daze, accepting hugs from leather-clad men whose faces triggered forgotten memories. These weren't just random bikers, they were Hells Angels from chapters across the western United States, each wearing their colors proudly despite the early morning hour. I still can't believe this, she murmured to Jake, who was coordinating the controlled chaos. When word got out through the network that Jake Morrison's chapter was stranded at Sarah Williams' place, said Marcus, the tattooed sergeant-at-arms, every chapter within 500 miles started moving. Angel of Highway 70 isn't just a trucker legend, bikers know that name too. Sarah looked around in amazement. She recognized patches from different chapters: Oakland, Denver, Phoenix, Salt Lake City. Men who normally wouldn't be caught dead in the same state were sharing coffee and stories at her counter. A massive man with Oakland on his back and arms like tree trunks approached her. 23 years ago, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, you found me passed out in your parking lot. Hypothermia. You called the ambulance, rode with me to the hospital, even called my old lady to let her know I was alive. Sarah stared at him, the memory slowly coming back. A younger man, barely conscious, his bike broken down in a snowstorm. Big Mike Hendricks, he said, extending a hand. President of the Oakland chapter, I owe you my life. The stories kept coming. A biker from Phoenix whose bike had broken down, Sarah and Robert had let him sleep in the diner while waiting for parts. A rider from Denver whose daughter had been in an accident, Sarah had given him directions to the fastest route and coffee for the road. Jake approached with a thick envelope, his expression serious. $68,000, he announced to the crowd. Cash, from every chapter represented here. Sarah stared at the envelope, hands trembling. This is too much, I can't. You can and you will. Big Mike interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. This money comes with conditions. What conditions? You keep this place running, said a woman biker from Salt Lake City, the first female Hell's Angel Sarah had ever met. You keep being the angel you've always been. Jake produced a rolled paper, an architect's drawing of the diner expanded with a proper biker lounge, secure parking for motorcycles, and maintenance facilities. Midnight Haven Biker Haven, he explained. Official rest stop for every Hell's Angels chapter from California to Colorado. We'll guarantee regular business, provide security, handle maintenance. A grizzled veteran from Phoenix stepped forward. We're also setting up a protection detail. Nobody messes with this place or you ever. You're under Hell's Angels protection now. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life. Breaker 19, this is Road Dogg calling for the Angel. We got 40 bikes rolling your way from Utah. ETA 30 minutes. Sarah picked up the microphone with shaking hands. Road Dogg, this is Midnight Haven, Angel. Heard through the grapevine you were in trouble. Salt Lake chapter is rolling hot to help out. We ain't letting anything happen to our guardian angel. The cheer that erupted from the packed diner rattled the windows. Outside, motorcycle engines revved in celebration, creating a thunder that echoed off the mountains. Jake approached with one final envelope. This is from Tommy Patterson. He's a prospect with our Denver chapter now. Used to be a trucker till you saved his life. Inside was his old business card and a note. 13 years I carried this. Time to bring it home where it belongs. Thank you for giving me a second chance at life. As the various chapter presidents began discussing logistics for the expanded operation, Sarah found herself outside, looking at the sea of motorcycles that filled every available space. Chrome and steel gleamed in the sunlight, and the patches told stories of brotherhood, loyalty, and a code of honor most people would never understand. Jake approached, his own bike loaded and ready. You know what the best part of all this is? Last night, you didn't see Hell's Angels or outlaws. You just saw 15 men who needed help, and you opened your door. That's what started this, Sarah. He climbed onto his Harley. Keep the light on, Angel, and don't worry, you've got the most powerful protection in America watching over this place now. As the Thunder Ridge chapter rode out, their engines creating a symphony of power, Sarah felt Robert's presence beside her. She could almost hear his voice. I told you this place would be special, baby. I just never imagined it would become the heart of something this big. 6 months later, Midnight Haven Biker Haven was featured in Easy Riders magazine as the most important Hell's Angels gathering spot west of the Mississippi. The parking lot was expanded to accommodate over 100 bikes, and the security was legendary. Nobody caused trouble within 50 miles of Sarah's place. But Sarah didn't need magazine recognition to know what she'd accomplished. Every day brought bikers from chapters across America, all finding exactly what they needed in her corner of Colorado: respect, good food, and the knowledge that they were welcome. The CB radio crackled constantly with bikers calling in, "How's our angel doing tonight?" Sarah always answered the same way, "The lights on, the coffee's hot, and the road's always open for family." Because that's what Midnight Haven had become, the unofficial headquarters of Western Hells Angels hospitality, proof that respect and kindness could bridge any gap, and that sometimes the most unlikely guardians were the ones who protected what mattered most. The light would always guide them home.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.